Hello everybody, welcome to lesson or chapter 1.2, the practice of declamation. This is lecturer Marcus Romo. Welcome. So, let's begin our journey with our welcome meditation. Ingressus ad rostram. It's a Roman declamation welcome meditation in order to ground ourselves, open up our senses, be here and now, and step onto the forum. Step onto the forum. Sit tall as if the curule chair were behind you and the marble beneath your feet. Close your eyes. Hear the distant clang of the blacksmith, the murmur of the crowd, the cooing pigeons along the basilica. This is your forum animi, the market square of your mind. Number 2. Invoke silencio. 3 legion breaths. Inhale through the nose to a silent count of 1, 2, 3, filling the chest like a war galley catching wind. Hold for 1, 2, as a cohort steadies the shields. Exhale through the mouth for 1, 2, 3, 4. Let intention march out across the stones. Repeat once or twice more. Each exhale clears the dust of travel, leaving only polished marble thought. Status corporis, align the orator's frame. Feel your spine rise as the colossus approaches. Unbending, watchful, let your shoulders fall back like the folding of legion standards after victory. Unclench the jaw, soften the brow. The mind's senate was made without civil war of muscles. Name the inner factions. In a whisper of inward voice declare, timor, sed, non dominus. Fear, yet not my master. Then fatigatio, sed servit. Weariness, yet it serves. Finally, animus, imperator sum. I am commander of my spirit. Let each faction take its appointed bench, silent until called to speak. Feel the gravitas of the rostrum. Place your dominant hand on your sternum, 2 fingers touching the pulse. This is your living stylus, ready to inscribe convictions in the air. Sense the weight of potential words, gathering like senators before a decree. Offer preceptum, a guiding maxim. Breathe in and recite inwardly. Verba facta parient. Breathe out an answer. May my words beget deeds. Let the maxim settle like fresh ink on wax tablets. Then, the last but not least, return with authoritas. Open our eyes. The classroom, your work area, is your comitium. Classmates are consuls in waiting. The moment you speak, write. Speak and write with the calm thunder of Cicero and the steady flame of Seneca. You carry the republic of thought, of rhetoric, of Roman declamation. Ward it well. Rise now onto declamation. Welcome. Let's continue with our agenda. Stop looking for purpose. Start forging identity. Let's imagine for a moment walking into first century Roman school. The master does not ask, "Who are you?" or "What is your life purpose?" Questions that fill our feeds and inboxes and social media or ChatGPT responses today. Instead, he tosses a wooden sword at your feet and assigns a controversia. Defend a tyrannicide, justify a runaway soldier, prosecute a defiant son. Worth is measured by how fiercely you argue, how quickly you counter, how boldly you act. Identity for Rome's elite is earned in combat, physical or by the words, verbal now, literal tomorrow. It's never discovered through idle and simple reflection. Ancient authors reinforce this crowd. Pliny, Cicero, Seneca. None of them write about purpose in the modern sense. The free citizen does not find himself. He finds himself season after season, like a legionary forging new armor after each campaign. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and stoic, writes in his diary, "Do not debate, act. Fear in action, not mistakes." For the Roman mind, endless self-analysis breeds paralysis. The cycle our digital age calls a dopamine loop of trying to find your calling. Action, not introspection or endless thought, confers our power. Yet declamation is more than action for action's sake. It's a practice that can ignite a revolution of consciousness, mind, speech, dialogue, rhetoric in our own time. When we enter a declamatory exercise, we stop and step escapism. We step into a laboratory where ideas are tested against reality, where words carry real stakes, where dialogue reshapes the mind of speaker and listener alike. Modern life often rewards those who talk the loudest. Declamation trains us to speak with precision, not with the loudest ideas, to listen for nuance, and to build arguments that create value for communities, for our fellow peers, for our organizations, rather than noise for algorithms. In choosing a position and defending it under fire, reshaping a civic muscle that our fragmented discourse desperately needs. The content for today holds that lesson to practice. It's a short but powerful lesson. You will see how rhetorical drills were identity-forging crucibles that push students of rhetoric to quit chasing abstractions and start mastering concrete challenge. We trace 5 Roman principles. Silence signals maturity. Speak only when words carry weight. 2. Mission equals what you are willing to break for. Commitment precedes comfort. 3. Boldness precedes clarity. Courage generates insight. 4. Learning is a weapon, not a refugee. Knowledge counts only when tested. Action shapes definition. Build, test, repeat. Titles follow deeds. At the end of this short lesson today, you can draft, deliver, analyze a short law and defend a declamation that forces you to take a public position. No safe philosophizing, only decisive rhetoric. Quit searching for who you might be and start speaking as the person you choose to become. The Roman rostrum awaits, and with the chance to spark a rhetoric that heals, divides, and multiplies value. That said, let's begin with our content. The practice of declamation and rhetorical education. Declamation is an educational practice. As such, it is both an exercise aimed at acquiring a set of skills and the operational aspect of a discipline that rhetoricians propose to instill through example, embodied by individual controversies. The discipline in question is known as the theory of doctrine of status, corresponding to Greek stasis, and in Latin to expressions such as constitution, used by the anonymous author of the Rhetorica and Herennium. In Greek, this theory was elaborated first within the peripatetic school, later to be defined in the authoritative, but lost rhetorical arts of Hermagoras of Temnos. For organization, we know from the later manualistic tradition, especially from Cicero, the Rhetorica ad Herennium and Quintilian. Keep in mind that we are continue introducing the practice of declamation with historical facts. Concerning declamation, genetic relation to status theory, scholarly opinions differ. For a highly authoritative specialist such as Waltero Calvoli, declamations developed before the systematization of status theory and were an elaboration of this theory. For Emmanuel Berti, declamatory themes were instead created for illustrating it in its many ramifications and for providing students of rhetoric case types for exercising its applications. In fact, Berti believes that it is precisely in this requirement that we can see one of the chief factors determining the development of declamations as a didactic tool for students. But what does status mean in status theory? Even the definition of this key term has undergone a series of progressive tweaks, and it's hardly unequivocal in the sources. Just as the identification of the different status and their separation into general classes was debated, what we can say is that the typology of the question around which the conflict between the parties of a case revolves is substantially the crux of the issue. The conflict between the parties of a case revolves. From this perspective, the classification attributed by later sources to Hermagoras distinguishes between status rationalis and status legalis, the former relating to judgments about the facts at stake in the controversy. The latter relating to the legal principles that govern it. Rational status in turn have an internal division, which can we synthetically reconstruct as follows. There is a conjecture, status conjecturalis, or conjectura, when there is some question of identifying whether the subject has committed the action input to him or not. Definition, status finitibus or finitium, comes into play when there is an agreement on the identity of the guilt part, but not on the precise definition of the committed act. The broadest and most important rational status quality, status qualitatis or qualitas, has to do with cases where there is agreement both on the fact and on its definition, but the guilty part claims to have acted accordingly to the law, or at least justifiably. Because of its broadness, this status was in turn variously distinguished as qualitas negocialis, not entirely well defined by the theory, but relating more to the deliberation about the future than to defining past events, or qualitas juridicialis, relating to juridical situations. The juridical quality could be absoluta, if the accused claimed to have acted completely within the law, without needing to appeal to external justification, or absolutiva, if innocence were insisted to be judged on the basis of assumed external elements. Thus, In the assumptive judicial quality, there may be a relevant issue of comparatio. It was inevitable to act in one way or another, and the way in which the accused act was the more just or more advantageous for the group or for a great number of subjects, or for the counterpart itself. Relation or translation criminis. The accused act provoked by others over the injured party, which merited the punishment. Remotio criminis. Give the belongings to something or someone who was compelled, accused to act criminally, or concession, in the absence of other arguments, mitigating circumstances such as chance, compulsion, or necessity, could be invoked or beginning the mercy of the court. The last and most vague status rationalis is translatio, or prescriptio, consisting of an exception raised by the accused around the legitimacy of the trial, for example, by claiming that the accuser had no right to make the accusation. The legal status instead relied to the law and its interpretation. The situations envisaged were again four: scriptum et voluntas, or scriptum et sententia. When there is a conflict between the spirit and the letter of the law, or as the ancients prefer to say, between the presumed intent of the legislator and available text, assuming that the former express the latter. Effectively, leges contraria, when there are mutually contradictory laws or contradictory principles with the same law. Ambiguitas, when the interpretation of a legal text is not immediate, obvious. And ratiocinatio or syllogismus, there is no opposite law for the situation or an existing legal rule must be applied by analogy. The system was highly ramified, and some theoreticians classified the status of different cases into more minute subdivisions than those defined by the canonical typology. For each of the status, there were standard procedures and arguments to rely on. In fact, we must not forget that status theory has a part to play in invention. That is, it belongs to the branch of rhetorical training and practice aimed at identifying, finding what arguments would be most advantageous to one's case. The declamations serve very well for this, since their themes were developed precisely to exemplify this or that status. The link between theory and exemplification is clearly captured in the manualistic tradition of the imperial period, beginning with Quintilian's seminal Instituto Oratorio. Here on screen is an example from Fortunatius Ars Rhetorica, belonging to the 4th century CE. In how many ways does the status of the letter and the spirit manifest itself? In two. Either when one of the parties relies on the written text of the law and the other on its spirit, or when both parties set aside the written text and debate its intention. When one of the parties appeals to the letter of the law and the other to the spirit, how is it? Here's an example. If a foreigner climbs the walls, let him be condemned on a capital charge. A foreigner climbs the walls and drives backs to the enemy. He is brought up on charges, but he rejects the charges. Besides illustrating the convention of approaching a topic through question and response, this extract demonstrates the close relation between the type of status. In this case, it is one of the legal status named that of scriptum et voluntas, and the declamatory theme exemplifying it. The manualistic tradition naturally pursued transparency for didactic purposes, It is worth asking then if the nexus between status theory and declamatory theme can be observed in the four corpora at our disposal. To answer this question, we have only the anthology of Seneca the Elder and the Declamationes Minores of Pseudo-Quintilian. These are the only collections in which, alongside the text of the controversies, we also find commentary, the most appropriate site for discussing the relation of a certain theme to one of the defined status. One example is Controversia 7.3 from Seneca's anthology, in which a son, caught pounding up a poison he claims it is for himself, is brought upon charges of attempted parricide. Here Seneca informs us that he will not, as normal, explain how the rhetoricians involved in discussing the theme went about deciding on its classification. The controversy was in fact clearly of a conjectural type, and belonged to the first of the status rationales. Therefore, the only point open to discussion was whether the poison was in fact intended for the father or not. In Pseudo-Quintilian Declamations Minores, a section under the rubric Sermo, conversation or discussion, portrays the master as the anonymous rhetorician. He is conventionally called speaking in the first person and providing suggestions to students on how to develop a theme informs that often permit us to see concrete scholastic practice, and indeed almost to catch up a glimpse of pedagogy in action. In this controversy that you can see, there is a question of goods exchange between two soci. I have often repeated to you how you can easily identify the status of a case. You know what they are in general. So, first go through them one at a time, rejecting any that does not clearly apply to the case in question. Then consider those that remain, and consider in this way. See what question the actor proposes, and what the proprietor responds or the defendant. The question should emerge from this comparison, and it will be the question that indicates the status. I am not telling you that you must base yourselves on the first thing that the actor says, and on the first response of the counterparty. In fact, the status is not inferred from the question first posed, but from the most relevant one. Of course, the teacher is not always so explicit, and at times his suggestions for the treatment of a theme are furnished more ambiguously. One example can be found in Declamations Minores 247, recently highlighted by Antonio Stramaglia. Let the wife inherit her husband's property. A rich young man commits rape. Before the girl makes her choice, he sends relatives to ask her to marry him. After hearing their pleas, she remains in silence, crying. The young man kills himself. Before he dies, she agrees to marry him. But both his relatives and the woman claim his property. This case turns on whether the woman can rightly be considered the man's wife, since despite exercising her right to choose between her rapist's death and marriage to him, as recognized by declamatory jurisprudence, the marriage has not been consummated because of the man's suicide. The question is not trivial, as its resolution regards the right of the woman to inherit the dead man's property. In the sermon, the teacher hypothesizes what the rapta could say to prove she is the man's wife and how the counterparty might object. He concludes, all this requires being concentrated in a definitione. A wife is a woman attached to a man through marriage, who has gone to live with him. Something similar can be said about minor 292, focused on the vague legal category of causa mortis, punishable by death. Here too, the teacher specifies that the question of law posed by the controversy requires treatment through definition. In both cases, the students understood very well that the status to which the rhetorician referred was the status finitibus, called also finitio, in which a definition of the situation must be proposed. In this case, the status of the protagonist. That is most favorable to the party whose point of view is being expressed. It is not entirely accurate to say that these kinds of suggestions for constructing arguments are found only in the minores. Recently, Antonio Stramalia has studied a figure of what he calls the hidden teacher, examining a series of cases from the declamaciones mayores, in which students are instructed on discursive strategies, not alongside the text of the declamation, as in the Sermon of the Minores, but within the oration itself, between the lines, as if there were captions woven into the fabric of the discourse and meant to reveal the technical presuppositions that govern its creation. I report one of the many examples given by Stramalia relating to status theory and taken from the sixth major of Pseudo-Quintilian, in which the conflict involves the fate of the son. The fate of the son, who, in order to free his father from pirates, abandons a mother who has demanded support from him, and whom now, after his death, wishes to leave him unburied. But what does the law say? A son who abandons his parent in misfortune is to be cast out unburied. Certainly, all that is a dispute between us in this case, judges, concerns the letter and the meaning of the law. Are we to take our stand on its ambiguous phrasing or on our confidence in its intention? In this case, the bill of declamatory fiction is seen, and behind the mask of the speaker, the father who pleads for his son's burial, stands a rhetorician who constructs the discourse and who explains how the case in question should be referred to the legal status of scriptum et voluntas, suggesting that it is the legislation invention or intention that must form the basis, and in fact would later form the basis of an effective defense of the father's position. References to status theory are thus sprinkled throughout the collections of declamations, sometimes in adjoined didactic sections that offer hints and suggestions to teachers and students, and sometimes as captions directed to those who attend the recitation of the fictitious discourse. Still, despite the major theoretical relevance of the theory and its very close linkage to declamatory practice, it is telling that the term status occurs only once in Pseudo-Quintilian's Minores, and never in Seneca the Elder's collection. Even if Seneca obviously knew the relevant terminology, given that on a couple of occasions he describes a case of conjecturalis, thus assessing it to the first of the rational status identified by rhetorical theory. Again, the parallel with Greek tradition as represented by the Manual of Sopatros is illuminating. In his division of questions, Sopatros oscillates between didactic, theoretical sections and short pieces for exemplification, not unlike Pseudo-Quintilian in the Minores. However, in Sopratos's work, the declamations are not organized casually, but instead follow the order of the status that had been established by Hermogenes, the rhetorician whose doctrines from the 3rd century CE onwards had prevailed over Hermagoras. Thus, Sopatros begins from conjecture, and provides at the beginning of each new section the necessary theoretical information, along with a list of the arguments to use in relation to the status in question. The controversies of Pseudo-Quintilian, like those of Seneca the Elder, can also easily be referred to the framework of the status. In fact, this work has already been done. However, this classification has been accomplished post factum, since in those collections, except in very rare cases, there is almost systematic exclusions of material explaining the connection between the declamatory theme and the status to which it belongs. It is difficult to understand why this could be. Seneca the Elder was not a rhetorician by trade, but rather an amateur, more interested in collecting and transmitting the stylistic adornments of declamatory texts than in their legal and doctrinal technicalities, although he has sometimes been credited with a comprehensive understanding of status theory. But this is not the case for Pseudo-Quintilian, who was fully versed in the subtleties of the theory and whose minores had an obvious didactic aim. Moreover, at least in one case, the master explicitly refers to the need to identify the status to which a theme belongs, and even recommends strategies for correct identification, suggesting that one must not be led astray by the initial rationales of the parties, which often turn on secondary questions. But apart from this, and a few others less formal allusions to status, the problem is almost never addressed in the minores. Perhaps this anthology is intended for advanced students who were capable of recognizing the presence and the action of the theory in the very fabric of the discourse without it having to be made explicit. Perhaps, as Michael Winterbottom has suggested, the opposite is true, and the minores were directed at beginners who were too inexperienced and too likely to be confused by the technicalities of theory. Perhaps, as Emmanuel Berti has suggested, students did not need any prior knowledge of the theory, since learning the status went hand in hand with learning to organize a proper division and to structure an effective argumentatio. Or perhaps we should think of the declamations as having their own autonomous value, which is separate from exemplification of this theory, as well as a discursive complexity that does not always lend itself to some rigid underlying theoretical framework. Rhetorical training itself tried to give an account of this complexity, when it is specified that in addition to a main status, each could cause and also present one or more status incidentes, which intervene in the treatment of secondary questions and could be different from the main one. But such detailed subdivisions, even if they had some didactic utility, are usually abandoned in the practice development of a declamation. In short, and to finish this content, the impression we get from reading anthologies is that the declamations, while originating as a useful exercise for the clarification and the teaching of a complex rhetorical theory, were eventually freed from the constraints of this theory and from the ancillary function, even if careful analysis can, here and there, still identify traces of this original didactic function, of the different themes and the status they were called upon to illustrate and exemplify. But we have reached the moment of setting aside these aspects of text theory in order to try to understand who and what a Roman declamation speaks about. This is what we will see in the next chapter, content 1.3. So now, let's proceed with our activity. Letter versus spirit. Choose your stance. Decide whether you will defend the literal penalty, cast out, bury it, or condemn it by appealing to the spirit of the law. Ask, in the specific aspect of the fate of the son, does the son's specific conduct justify extreme punishment? What larger social good did the law aim to protect? Research and outline. Identify at least 2 Roman precedents or philosophical principles, for example, pietas, clementia, utilitas publica. Draft a brief fact pattern. Why were the parents in misfortune? What were the son's motives? Try to analyze, try to make your statement here. If sources are scarce, invent plausible Roman details consistent with historical norms. Compose your oratoria. Let's use, for example, this Ciceronian sequence of exordium, narratio, confirmatio, refutatio, peroratio. Spring at least 3 rhetorical devices: antithesis, tricolon, rhetorical question, metaphor, or a sharp sententia. He who buries mercy will one day beg for it. Now perform. Deliver your speech standing. Without notes, if possible. Just by memorization, but notes would be great. Maybe a short video. Maintain gravitas, vary pace, and use controlled gestures of Roman declamatories. Peer tribunal and feedback. Maybe your classmates can act as judges, voting guilty or not guilty. Each judge must cite one persuasive element that's weighed them. Focus critique on clarity, logical force, and emotional resonance. Not an agreement with stance. And the last part, reflection. Write how you balance letter and spirit in this particular aspect of the fate of the son. And what you learn about modern dilemmas, for example, mandatory sentencing, corporate policy, etc. So this, we have finished our chapter 1.2, the practice of declamation. For you to understand more context about what we are talking about and what we want to accomplish in this short course. Please try to elaborate on your activity. Post it on the comment sections on this article on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening, hearing, watching. See you in our next chapter about themes and characters from declamations. We are starting to be a little bit more rich with declamation contents, so you can grasp what are the main characters of the declamations, and so you can start picking, selecting your own characters for your own speeches, declamations, and writings. Remember, try to act on them. Record a short video and share it on the comment section in the LinkedIn article. Thank you. Some reference that we are gathering information here from Mario Lentano, The Practice of Declamation and Rhetorical Education. Thank you. This was lecturer Marcos Romo, coach and leadership consultant. See you soon in the next chapter. Goodbye.